because we want to talk, and we already started this topic, a little bit about the relationship between ICA and the constituent group. So these are some of the things I would like to talk about. So roles and responsibilities that we have, the monitoring functions that are built into that process and that we are obligated to perform as per our agreement with the federal government, joint liability issues, and talk a little bit about interpreters. By the way, our interpreters here, there were a number that had said they were coming. Hi, thank you for coming. Yeah, just back in the corner. Oh yeah, two interpreters are here. So our volunteer interpreters are wonderful people that have come forward, and there's others, so they just couldn't all be here today. Some people had other commitments. And they have basically said, we want to help with this process. So the volunteer interpreters at this point are all Arabic speakers coming from different parts of the Middle East and are supporting us. So they're fully screened. They have done their security screening because they will be assisting newcomers you know, in various situations, be it when they take the children to school for the first time. It could be during a medical appointment. It could be during a conversation where we're talking about other family members that might want to come and that might need to be sponsored. So they are wonderful, and we thank you very much for doing this work and for supporting us all. Thank you. So some fundamental principles of this relationship between sponsorship agreement holder, ICA in this case, and the constituent group. First of all, it's very important that we try to get as good an understanding of this very complex process and our various roles and responsibilities as we possibly can. And this is, you know, easier said than done. I know people have watched webinars that are being put on by the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program. Those are wonderful learning experiences, and people have said to me afterwards, I still don't understand this. And so, or we have had a meeting of an hour and a half or 2 hours, and people are saying, now I'm totally confused. So, and I hope it's not me. I hope it's just the process. But it is a very, very complex relationship with multiple facets, you know, ranging from what actually happens with refugees, how do they come to Canada, to things like fundraising and how does the money get dealt with, and you know, the tax receipts. I would say probably about 25% of the questions I get from the constituent group members have something to do with the money. So yeah, and it's anything and everything around so-called missing donations, which often, you know, resolve because of the way we're doing the accounts, and, you know, things are actually not missing, they are just not where somebody expected them to be. So I'll talk a little bit about how that works with the financial reports. So a lot of it is around that process. But it starts with something even more fundamental. So sometimes in the conversations we have, there's a lot of confusion around who is a constituent group member and who is a donor and who is a friend of the constituent group and who are all these people. So really, from our perspective, primarily we're dealing with people that are members of constituent groups. So these are people that will be very directly involved in bringing the refugees to Canada and then helping those newcomers for the first year while they're settling in this new community. There can be other people that get involved later on that don't really want to become, or they say they don't want to become officially a member of the constituent group. However, if they are involved in any way, shape, or form directly with the newcomers and potentially in an unsupervised capacity, they need to be fully screened by us. And for our purposes, we really treat them as constituent group members, okay? Even if they maybe don't see themselves as such because they weren't involved from the start or whatever criteria people apply to that understanding. So this is what it is from our perspective, because the minute somebody is involved, the minute somebody is, you know, transporting people in a car or taking children to school or anything like that, they need to undergo the same scrutiny as people that were in the constituent group from the first day. Donors are very different. Donors are simply people that give money to the effort. Obviously, they don't need to be screened for anything, and even if they might be in Victoria and might have been involved in some early discussions and are generally supportive and ask the constituent group to keep them posted on what's going on, they don't need to be screened for anything, but they also shouldn't get detailed knowledge of anything, right? So basically, you treat these donors the way Sasha explained it earlier on in terms of giving more general information about where things are at in the process. You wouldn't be using names, you certainly wouldn't be using photos that you're sending around to these people. You would be just talking in more general terms and letting them know, keeping them posted where things are at in the process, okay? So sometimes people say, well, when are we formally a constituent group? Well, you're formally a constituent group when we've authorized you to be a constituent group. So it's very clear in our contract with the federal government that ICA has the right and decides whom we authorize as a constituent group and whom we do not authorize as a constituent group. So, you know, if somehow things didn't feel right, or it seemed like there was a lot of group conflict, or people within the group weren't consistent and they couldn't come to any type of agreement on anything, and there wasn't a proper management going on with the group dynamics, we could say, well, you know, maybe not right now. Maybe you need to work through some issues yourself first, okay? And so we try to do this by me meeting with you once, twice, sometimes 3 times, you know, it depends on the circumstances. And then, you know, when we decide, well, you know, this is a viable group, it seems like a viable group, then there's a number of things that need to happen. So one of the things that need to happen, and you've all done this, all of you who are here in the room, is to fill in a form, which is essentially a volunteer application form. We call it somewhat different because it's not general volunteering with ICA. It's a specific volunteer engagement as a member of a constituent group, where you're telling us a little bit about yourselves, why you want to do this, what your background is, what kind of skills might you be bringing to this process. And then there is the criminal record check form. So we are obligated to do criminal record checks on everybody who gets involved in refugee sponsorship, because refugees are considered vulnerable populations. So it always includes the vulnerable sector check. And we process those through the Ministry of Justice, and often many of you, especially if you're female, will not hear again from me unless you want your clearance letter, and that's fine, you can ask it of me. Some of the male constituent members in the group might know that you get a very nice letter from the Ministry of Justice asking you to come in for fingerprinting. And that's just because they check against the various offender lists, particularly the sex offenders list. And so there are, for the most part, males sitting on that list. And the minute you have a birth date that coincides with somebody on that list, or also apparently when the name is the same or similar, you might get pulled in for fingerprinting. This happens more often than not, actually. So I've heard that from various male members of our constituent group. So it's nothing really to worry about. It just is what it is, and it's just the ministry doing due diligence. Yeah, so sometimes constituent groups fundraise a lot, some of them a lot, before they've actually formally taken on any case or have, for all intents and purposes, formally being authorized by us as a constituent group. You can do this, we facilitate it if you want to do this. It's just, and I caution you that basically the risk is on your side, right? If you fundraise $20,000 into an account for a case you want to take on, and then something happens, you can take on a case. Maybe your group is really falling apart and people have said, well, we've now heard about this takes a year and we've had enough and we're not going to do this. We can't give you your $20,000 back because now we issued income tax receipts for them, so the control of the funds is with us, right? So this is really your risk. So generally speaking, we try to open the account and encourage you to start your fundraising as close as possible to actually authorizing you as a constituent group, and then you know, doing and looking at cases and you taking on a case. That's in theory. It obviously doesn't always happen like that, but just a word of caution about that. It was particularly an issue, obviously, at the end of the year when people were rushing and wanted to get donations in because they wanted tax receipts, and some groups, you know, hadn't been officially authorized and certainly not taken on a case. So just that this is clearly understood. Yeah, Rita, you had a question.
The way we worked around that was we got pledges. So we could go to Sabine and say we wanted a family of 8 without knowing how much money we were able to raise. So we asked for pledges. We had a 3-week or 4-week deadline or something. We knew exactly how much money we'd be able to get, and then we were able to say, okay, give us a match.
Yeah. And that's a very clever way of doing it. So what Rita is saying here is that you could do it by collecting pledges. Whatever you mean by that. Some people just mean a commitment. Some people actually collect a check from the people that have said and just keep that check, right? And then basically, in this case, this was a BVOR case. So the minute we take on a BVOR case, it has to be quick, okay? We get 2 days to say yes to the government about the case, and then they give us a week to put in a sponsorship undertaking. At that point, I needed to say to Rita, I need, whatever the amount was, I need $40,000 in the account. But because she had collected checks, she was able to do that. You know, she just came in and deposited the checks. So that is a way around this. You know, if something fell apart and the group really said, well, now we don't want to do it at all, right? You could just give them back their checks. Yeah.
So we have our CG number. We've been collecting donations, and we sent in our paperwork. But does that mean that there's still a step before formal authorization?
Which group are you with again?
701 for Syria.
701 for Syria, yeah. You haven't taken on a case.
No, we haven't got a case,
so
no.
That would be the next step now, right? Then we'd have a meeting to talk about the case.
And that's where I'm saying, you know, there is this gap essentially, and that happened particularly around the end of the year, because during the rest of the year there isn't this great urgency with the tax receipts, right? So it would be important to have a meeting and talk about a case.
Right. So I think we're under the impression we had to have like the half of it raised before we could get a case.
By the time you take on the case officially, by the time you put the application through. So yeah, so we can always talk about cases. You can always, you know, start working on a case and accept a case. The minute we put the application through to Winnipeg, that's when we're liable financially for this and for the settlement, right? That's when the point occurs where the liability sets in.
Okay.
Could you say a little bit more about pledges and how that works? And another question related to that is, for example, if in the family you have a child that has great musical ability, somebody wants to pledge so much a month for that child to get music lessons. Is that possible?
So, sorry. So pledges, as I said, there's different ways people understand that word. And I've just noticed that from talking with groups. So some people simply understand it as somebody making a commitment and saying, if you take on a case, I'll give you $2,000, right? And that is, I mean, neither here nor there. If you know that person well and you trust them and you know they will follow through, then you know that for a fact. I don't, right? Or it could be like in Rita's case where they actually collect the checks, right? And so she said, I have to the minute we take on the cases. The former, okay. But you knew the people well enough that you were confident that there was no issue with that, yeah. So in terms of pledges, yeah, what you're talking about is really monthly donations, right? So a monthly donation can be made for a case, and the way this can be done through our website is that people go in and go and pick the Refugee Sponsorship Fund, put in the number of your group, and then click on monthly donations. There is a button where people can make monthly donations. So this is a possibility. Now, of course, if everybody in your group did that, you know, it wouldn't give us the amount of money that we would need necessarily to put through the case. We still would need sort of that amount that we establish that would be sufficient for us to put the application through, that would make us feel comfortable enough saying, okay, this group is serious, there's going to be no problems, we'll put it through. Because those donations only come through every month, and somebody can cancel that at any point in time.
Yeah, if I understand this correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think she's actually necessarily, possibly speaking about a monthly donation, but actually I think what she's talking about is, Tricia's talking about is an earmark. This child is musical ability, the donor wants to earmark it for music lessons, and I suspect, just having gone through this process, again, please correct, but I suspect that you would, that would be something that you might put in as an item in the resettlement plan.
Yeah.
If it's in the resettlement plan, then and there is a budget line attached to it, then yes, you
Yeah.
would earmark that, and you would put that in the message.
Yeah.
in the message. So it could come as a whole. The monthly piece, I don't know if that would work for that, but
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. So we can't earmark a particular donor for a particular activity. But that's exactly how it would work. So if we know in advance that this is something that is going to be important. So when we put the application through there, and we'll talk about the settlement plan in a minute, there is a budget attached to the settlement plan, which actually gets submitted to the federal government. So we talk about this budget in detail when we put through the application. And I usually do up sort of a kind of basic run-of-the-mill budget, you know, based on the standard family size. And then I send it to the sponsor and say, okay, take a look at this. Where do you think this is off? What else do you think needs to be there? And then it comes back, you know, and then we have a conversation about it. That's when this should be in, and that's when, you know, the donor might say, oh, you know, like you need so much money, you've budgeted so much for it, and I'm gonna pledge this. But, you know, it's the money then needs to be put towards that budget one way or the other, whether that donor eventually comes through or doesn't come through, right? So it's not in that way directly linked, it's an indirect link.
But someone had offered to pledge so much in money to our group. And they don't want to do it online, they aren't comfortable with online, anything that's over. Could she give us, for example, 12 post-dated checks?
Yeah. She can give you the post-dated checks, not us, please. And that's because, you know, we cannot handle post-dated checks with this large number of groups that we're operating with. So if she gives you post-dated checks and you give us one check every month, that's fine. It's totally fine.
yeah, I'm sorry, but this is earmarked for music lessons, right?
No, not
okay,
necessarily.
all right.
No. That was a separate question.
Yeah.
As Rita may have already had this discussion with you, I'm not sure, but it might be a benefit to everybody else, and I'm not sure myself. About the malleability of the budget. So say the family arrives, we discover after they've arrived that, you know, they have certain gifts or needs, and so we need to shift the money around within the established budget, or potentially fundraise more if necessary. What is our relationship to you with respect to the budget?
Right. Yeah, so the question is about what happens with the budget after the newcomers have arrived, and now obviously budgets are always fluid and things change. So typically shortly after the family or whoever it is has arrived, we sit down and have a meeting about the budget. We need to have probably more than one meeting about the budget, certainly in the early days, you know, in the first 2 months or so. In particular, if we're dealing with a BVOR case, because things are not all in place right from the start. So for example, that RAP support that I was talking about earlier, that we know now that this takes a while to kick in, and there's all kinds of paperwork that needs to be done. But more importantly, you know, this is just about how does the revenue flow into the budget. But more importantly, the question is, are these budget line items now still correct, right? So for example, many people had budgeted for bus passes. And, you know, I had said we need to budget for bus passes because we don't know. And then, you know, the BC Transit made a decision to essentially provide free bus passes from last year December until the end of this year December. So any refugees who come in during that period of time, they get 1 year free bus passes. Okay, So now if somebody comes, we sit down, we take out that budget line item, and we look at, does it need to go anywhere else or not? You know, is it just simply no longer needed because, and then that stays in your account and will eventually, if it's not needed, be made available for other cases. So that's sort of how it works, but it does necessitate several meetings, there's no question about that. But and that harks back to the question of, you know, our responsibility under Canada Revenue Agency. Any money that has come into our account for which we have issued charitable income tax receipts must be, and I'll put there's a very good information sheet that the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program did up on that very topic. It must stay within the control of the charity that has issued the charitable tax receipt. That's how it is. Okay. So I think that actually covers some of these issues that are up here. So let's just move on in the interest of time. So the pre-arrival breakdown of you know, our working relationship around forms and procedures is, we've talked about the ICA forms that you've already filled. We've talked about the crim checks. There is a formal agreement that ICA and the CG sign. Some of you have signed that, some of you have not. The reason is that we sign this agreement once you've taken on a case, because we identify the case in that agreement, because it's linked to the budget. So we need to be specific about, is this a family of 5? Is this a family of 4 with 2 other adults linked to them? How do we know about these people? What kind of a case is this? We put the budget in there, and we also put in there by when you should have raised which amount. So there's typically 2 amounts in that agreement. The first one is sort of the landmark when we will submit the application. And we obviously don't know that for a fact because we don't know exactly when that's going to occur. Typically, I put that date somewhere within the first month and a half after we've signed it for the privately sponsored cases or the privately referred cases. And that's usually sort of right on the mark. And usually at that point in time, for those cases, we want to see about 30% of the budget in our account. And then there is a secondary date in that agreement, which is the sort of foreseen date of when the newcomers will arrive. Now, this is even more of a guesstimate because we really don't know. So I always go on the assumption that they might be here within a half year to 7-8 months, right? And so that date might either be adjusted to occur earlier or it might be adjusted to occur later. If people all of a sudden come and you really weren't expecting them yet and you haven't fully fundraised, you know, don't panic. I mean, obviously the funding, the budget gets spent over the course of a year. So that's not, you know, the end of the world. The only problem is that most likely if you need to do fundraising, you won't have a lot of time to do fundraising by the time the newcomers are here because you'll be really busy with other stuff. And that's one of the reasons why we really like to see, you know, the vast majority of the funds in the account by the time people arrive, because otherwise it becomes problematic, because then you're doing pre-arrival and post-arrival stuff at the same time. So one other thing we ask people as it gets closer to the arrival of the newcomers is with regard to their cars. So all of you, or many of you, will be driving around people, and obviously there's unique liabilities associated with that. Not that there aren't liabilities associated with other activities. However, if you are driving people around in your car and you get into a car accident, you probably know that there can be huge costs associated with that. So ICA has a policy of a $3 million third-party liability for drivers that pertains to all of our staff and our volunteers who are considered similar to staff in that regard. So I will ask all of you as it gets closer to get your insurance policies, a copy of that page that shows your third-party liability, all of the drivers, and if you don't have 3 million, to please up that. Many people have 3 million, many people I've seen have 5 million, but some people have 2 million, so that's usually the lowest I'm seeing. So just to be aware of that. That this is early on in the process that you know this. And I usually don't ask for it right away because really you might not know exactly who's going to be driving. And there might also be at that point somebody else in the family, in your own family, who might become a driver and at that point will need to be security screened and do the criminal record check and all of that. So we usually wait a little bit until it gets closer to arrival. And then we work together on the forms. In terms of finances, as you all know, we open a case-specific account that's sitting in our general accounting system, but with a specific account number. Please, please, in all communication that you send out, don't tell people to put the name of your group into any donations. Please tell them to put the number of your group, because our poor accounting manager does not know what Refugees for Victoria group is, okay? So, and then he comes to me and says, do you know who these people are? So it's very important that you put always the number. Some groups actually don't have a name, but so then I just use their number for the name. Financial reports. So always a cause of a lot of confusion. Financial reports, I send them out the minute money comes into accounts once a month. These reports are always current, meaning itemized, you know, like line by line, per the end of the previous month. So, in other words, on the 15th of January, I sent out a financial report as per the end of December. In the early days when I did this, then people were screaming and saying, there should be a lot more money in the account. You know, somebody made this donation and somebody made that donation. Now, those were donations, obviously, that had then been made between the 1st of the month and the 15th of the month. In order to get around that, in the latest round of reports, I basically included itemized until the end of the month, 31st of December, and then the balance on, it was I think the 14th of January. Well, now I got emails saying, we don't understand what the difference is. Why is there a difference between this and that balance? So I'm still working on that, so please bear with me. I'm trying to find a way to explain this so that everybody understands it and that I don't get many emails about this. But that is essentially what it is. So the itemization of the donations that came in between the 1st and the 14th of January will show up in your next report. And that's typically what the difference is, okay? The other thing I want to mention with regard to financial reports is that checks go in within a couple of days, depending on, you know, how busy we are in accounting, and so they go usually in within a couple of days. Cash donations as well. Now, cash donations, if you have a large amount of cash because you've done a fundraiser, please, please send me an email and set up an appointment, because somebody's got to count that stuff with you when you come in. And, you know, reception is very busy. I can't expect our folks at reception to count all this money with you. So if you have $50, it's fine. They can, you know, check it off. It's okay. Tell them that you have cash. If you have an envelope, tell them that there's cash in it. But if you have a larger amount to drop off, please send me an email, make an appointment, and we'll go to my office and count it. It's also not good to stand at reception and count a lot of money. So it's just, well, it's not necessarily very, very safe. So to do that, yeah. So. And that will also go in just like checks, you know, fairly quickly. If we get the donation form filled with a credit card number, it's the same thing. We ring it through our machine, so it's fairly quick. The one that takes longer to show up in the financial reports that I'm sending to you are the donations that are coming in on Canada Helps. And this is just because Canada Helps doesn't immediately put a donation into our bank account. There's always a time lag, something like 7 or 8 days, until that amount actually goes into our bank account. And it's only then, when Canada Helps has released the funds to us, that the accounting manager takes all these released amounts and allocates them to the sub-accounts for your groups, okay? So if you can keep that in mind, And if somebody calls you, and says, well, I made a donation the day before yesterday, and do you know this? And then you get my report and you panic and say, well, no, it's not there. It's because most likely Canada Helps has not released that donation yet. So just be a bit patient on that one. Yeah.
I may be incorrect, but I think our group has its own bank account. How does that square with what you're saying?
Okay. So are you giving out your own tax receipts, or how are you dealing with
We
that?
got our own tax receipts.
You're with, remind me, which
Temple Emmanuel?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so you give out your own tax receipt. So this is a different scenario, mostly for the faith groups, but I have one other group that is also a charity. So they can give out their own tax receipt. So what you can do, you just hang on to this money until you have, taken on your case, and we have done the agreement, and we know what it is, and we know what the budget is, and then you write us a check. Yeah, easy. Okay.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, you're sending out these reports once a month. Is it then annoying to have the group's phone and, if you're writing an article and you want to say we've raised this much and, we're in between times we're phoning up and saying, can you tell us how much? Is that something you'd like us to avoid, or is that okay?
I wouldn't say annoying. I'm on camera. So let's just say it slows us down in other operations related to the private sponsorship of refugees, if you might call it that. I understand that it's coming from confusion around how this all works, and not everybody is an accountant. Some people understand accounting procedures well, others are artists, and others are whatever their professions might be, and we can't turn everybody into an accountant. I'm just trying to explain it in as simple terms as possible so you have an understanding of why that's the case. So one good procedure is always to wait until the next report. Another thing that happens a lot is that people phone me and say, or email me and say, somebody, John Smith, told me he was going to make a donation of $1,000, but it's not in my report. Okay. Well, if John Smith told you that they were going to make a donation, it doesn't necessarily mean they did. So, and that becomes tricky, because then you might say, well, I don't really want to call them and say, did you make this donation that you promised? The only other way to deal with that is to then say, well, we have to look in our records for that name. And if it happens to be Smith or something more common, it could be a bit more complicated. So yeah, that's another thing that happens a lot, just to keep in mind that if people tell you they're going to donate, unless it's like in a pledge, like Rita was describing, where there's really, these are people you know very well, and you have made an effort to collect these pledges, it might actually just not have come through. Okay. So these are some things that describe how we deal with the funds once people have actually arrived, so post-arrival. So there's 3 types of payments, generally speaking. There is rent. So rent is a big part of the budget. So what we typically do is, just to avoid, putting the rent into the newcomer's account, the newcomers may or may not have a sense of what expenses are like in Victoria. They probably don't know the currency. They might have a difficult time in the early stages figuring out, what they should be spending money on, and doing proper budgeting, and making sure there's still something in the account towards the end of the month. So we like to pay the rent directly to the landlords. And so the way this would work is that once you've rented a place, we can set the landlord up for direct payment. We can also, in the earlier stages, if you have difficulty finding housing because the landlord says, well, these folks are not here and we don't know who we are renting to, we can give a rent guarantee letter. So we can write a letter, and we've done that for some groups, saying that ICA is guaranteeing the rent for this particular family for a period of from here to here. And that's usually very helpful with landlords, because obviously one of the big things they're worried about is getting their rent in full and on time. So there's other things we can't do anything about. The fact that newcomers don't have Canadian references, there's nothing we can do about that. That will get sorted over time, but there's also messaging around that you can use, and that has been effectively used, and that is basically yourselves. Remember that Sasha said, you are your best, advocate and messenger. Tell the landlord who has these concerns that yes, the newcomers might not have these references, but there's 15 people in your constituent group who are all established Canadians who know the laws, who know what needs to happen, who will work very closely with the newcomers. If there's anything that needs to be discussed between landlord and newcomer, they can call you in, they can use you as an intermediary. So give the landlord some assurance on that front as well, okay? So then there's funds to constituent group members for receipted purchases, which by and large pertain to the startup costs, so things like furniture, bedding, towels, like everything you need to get the place ready. So, and then it might also pertain in the first 2 weeks or so before we actually have set up an account for the newcomers, or you have set up an account for the newcomers, and we can actually put regular payments into those accounts. Typically some cash at the airport because, they arrive, they obviously have no money, so that's what we've done in the past. Somebody from the constituent group has taken the money out of their bank account, and we have given them a check, to replace those funds. Just a second, Rob. And the first type of payment is then the regular payments into the newcomer's account. So once they have set up a bank account, which should occur as soon as possible after arrival, we will then have that budget meeting. We will sit down, we say, okay, what does this look like? What kinds of expenses are we taking out of the budget that we will not put on a regular basis into the account? For example, things like stuff we've set aside for medical costs that are not covered under either the MSP or the extended health, that we won't drop into their account on a regular basis because it's there on an as-needed basis. And then, if there's RAP support for the BVOR cases, we need to adjust the budgets several times. Later on, there's child tax benefit support coming in. So the budgets will probably be adjusted a number of times over the first few months. Rob, you had a question, yeah.
Who is the actual signer of the rental?
Of the rental, yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So who's the signer of the lease? So we strongly advise constituent groups against signing permanently on leases in their name. If you sign on the lease, you are the tenant. You're liable, okay? You don't really want to be liable for the behavior of people whom you actually don't know. So the way around that is, and most of the landlords, after some careful nudging, others without any problem have agreed to having a member of the constituent group sign the lease initially before arrival, and then when the newcomers arrive to assign that lease, to sign a new lease with the newcomers. So several of the landlords have been okay doing that. And hopefully, as we get to work more with landlords in town and with people that have a large number of properties to lease out, we can have these conversations to make that a smooth process. Yeah, Karen.
And just in our experience, it may be worth having a CG discussion about, because rent is so hard to find places, about if you have a sense that these people will be coming with them on securing the place, if the landlord will let you secure the place under somebody's name, and then switching when the people arrive. So it's a budget discussion. Are you willing to pay for an extra month that nobody might be in the apartment? Because which we actually did, and it worked out very well. It may not. It may be that the place is empty, but it's a good budget discussion to have with the CG.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Karen is talking about, that there might be a place might be empty for a month. It's entirely possible because it is a bit of a gamble. We don't know when some of these cases will arrive. We have a much better knowledge if it's a privately referred case. With the BVOR cases, we've been lucky so far. We have rented pretty much on target, but I do have a group that has a BVOR case which doesn't seem to be processing. We don't really know why, and they have rented since the 1st of January because for all intents and purposes, they had reason to believe, and I had reason to believe, that this case would arrive very shortly, and there's no progress on it. And nobody tells us why, and that's just sort of the situation we're in. There was another, yeah, interesting.
I was wondering if ICA has been in discussion with Pacific Housing, BC Housing Corporation. I approached Pacifica and they seemed to imply that they needed to talk to you too.
In the midst of all this, we are in a planning process.
Okay.
So we are definitely in touch with CRD Housing. Pacifica we have a long-term relationship with because even though these are new refugees, we have been receiving refugees in Victoria for many, many, many years, and other immigrants. So we have ongoing relationships. So we're just trying to cram in as many meetings as we can to get all this ironed out so that we all understand what everyone's doing. So it may feel like we're not moving as quickly as we can, but we are moving as quickly as we can, and we will continue to. So it should get better as time goes on.
It'd be great if there was just a general agreement that we could do that two-lease thing.
Yeah.
With, like, particularly Pacifica. It would be a great help.
Yeah.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, let's move on. So the settlement support is a joint responsibility between the constituent group and a settlement agency, obviously. So there are some things that you do, there are some things you do with our assistants. Sometimes it's not so clear. One important piece here is to kind of, for Alexandra and me, in our world, you know, handing things off to when you're working more closely with a settlement worker rather than with us. In the beginning, obviously, after arrival, constituents groups have a tendency to direct all questions to me, just because I'm the only person they know in ICA. But then there's things that are actually handled by some other colleagues, and I'm fully understanding of the situation. So just, you know, keep that in mind, bear with me. I will continue to work with you on certain things, like the RAP support issues, the budgetary issues, but sort of the day-to-day settlement support, if you need assistance there, if the newcomers need something, it's usually the settlement and other departments that will help with that. So let's move on, because now people are getting hungry and getting tired and need a break. So in terms of monitoring functions, we are obligated, obviously, to monitor the implementation of the sponsorship undertaking and to avoid a breakdown. So breakdown is just kind of the worst case scenario, and hopefully that will not happen, but I need to mention it here. There are no-fault breakdowns of sponsorships. No-fault breakdowns of sponsorships, you know, the classical case we always use is family walks off the plane in Toronto and goes through immigration and registers with the immigration officer, walks out the door and is never heard from again, okay? So, you know, it has happened. It has happened, not to us, but it has happened. Obviously, this is a no-fault breakdown because you had nothing to do with that, we had nothing to do with that. Our only obligation then is to be in touch with immigration and say this happened, this family never arrived, we were told they'd be coming and they never showed up on the plane. We don't know where they are. Okay, fine, this is no fault, right? Breakdown, a fault breakdown would be if your sponsorship group disintegrates and the minute the family has arrived, you're basically washing your hands off it and you're saying, we've had enough, we've waited for 1.5 years, you told us it was gonna be 5 months, and we are no longer interested. So that's a fault breakdown. So in order to avoid this from happening, that's why we're there. In that case, we would be looking for another sponsor who might be willing to take this on, or we would do it ourselves, right? So if it came to that. So that's why we stay in close contact with you and make sure that things are going okay and that there's nothing brewing in your constituent group that we might need to have a conversation about. So we are there to, once people are here to support you and the refugees and meeting those sponsorship commitments. we are at liberty to set our own monitoring criteria. So there's no general rules, or there's no specific rules in our agreement with the federal government as to how we are supposed to monitor you. So this is entirely left up to the individual sponsorship agreement holder. There's a reason for that, because there's such a wide variety of organizations that are sponsorship agreement holders that it would not be practical to have very specific rules around that. Many of these organizations are faith-based organizations. Some are very large faith-based organizations like the Mennonite Central Committee. Some are very small, maybe an Eritrean church community. Some are settlement agencies like we are. Some are ethnic associations. And these people function in very different ways. So that's why there is this liberty. So the CIC, or now the IRCC, also does monitoring. So they monitor us, and they also have the right, if the refugees have checked off in their applications that they give consent to being contacted in the future, they might interview refugees about their experience. They have the right to do that. They can do surveys of newcomers and of constituent groups. They have your information. As you know, those of you who have submitted undertakings, we submit all of your names and your telephone numbers. So they have the right to do that. They also will mediate and do conflict resolution if there is a pending sponsorship breakdown. As I said, hopefully we won't have to deal with this. They do take action in case of sponsorship breakdown and defaults, and they obviously, just like with any program, they have the right to do an audit. So interestingly enough, even though they're not really funding us for this program, they do have the right to do an audit, because we are, collecting funds on behalf of donors for private sponsorship of refugees, so that's their prerogative. By definition, refugees are vulnerable persons. So there's a variety of risk factors. Of course, this all reads rather ghastly, but these things have happened. So if you ever do one of these Plan to Protect webinars, they will give examples of stuff that has happened involving all and any of the above. So we're talking about issues of abuse, molestation, and harassment. It could be involving children, youth, or vulnerable adults. As a result, there could be such claims caused as a result of ourselves or you doing things that are based in not properly screening the people that are involved with the newcomers, which is why it is vitally important to let us know if all of a sudden a new person is getting involved who wasn't a member of the constituent group, but now all of a sudden they want to be a part of the process. We need to know that. We need to screen these people because we're jointly liable for what's going on there. So bodily injury in automobile transportation, that's, harks back to the insurance that we need to have in place there. Or any other bodily injury that is caused somehow in the course of this undertaking, and for which we can be held jointly liable. There's various types of abuse, physical, sexual, emotional, financial, spiritual, neglect. Just to maybe explain one or two of them. Let's take the spiritual one, for example. So what would, for example, count as spiritual abuse is if, let's say, the newcomers are of the Muslim faith, and we are trying to convince them, to come into some other faith community, right? So that would be considered spiritual abuse, for example. I guess the others are somewhat more obvious. So in the interest of time, we won't go into detail. So supervision is the key. So reducing those risks, that's really the key. And the 4 principles that Plan to Protect is using as principles of good supervision is that as the risk increases, the supervision should also increase. So let's say people want, newcomers want you to help them with babysitting while they have to go to some appointment. The risk increases because now you're alone with very small children, right? For your own protection and for the children's protection, it is always a good idea to have 2 people in such a situation. We do not enforce any strict 2 people always rules. However, there are circumstances where it is a good idea to not be in isolation with somebody from the newcomer group. And certainly doing babysitting at home in their place without anybody else, without an adult, without the parents present, is such a situation where it is highly advisable. Because if any claim is later made against you, you have no witness if you were by yourselves, right? So that's basically for your own protection. Risk increases as isolation increases. That's the same idea. You know, if you're at home alone with these children, that's an isolated situation, risk is higher. It increases as accountability decreases, you know, as you kind of are more off guard and you know, let that slip your accountability, then the risk gets higher. And when there's an imbalance of power, risk is also higher when there's control and influence issues. So that essentially, for example, if you think about what we talked about earlier with the landlord situation, you know, that's where you have that kind of scenario where you have an imbalance of power already built into the sponsorship relationship, and now all of a sudden you're creating a tenant-landlord relationship. That can be very complicated. The issue of so-called occasional observers, that's a term that Plan to Protect uses. I kind of like to use that too because it makes sense. We talk a lot about occasional observers in the groups. We might not call them that, but that's what we're talking about. People will say, well, what if my neighbor wants to put on a potluck when the newcomers are here? They're not a member of our group, but what if they want to do that? Well, you know, if they want to do that and a number of you are there and there's always somebody in the room who's a member of the constituent group, no problem. They are an occasional observer, okay? They're not alone with the newcomers. You are there to monitor them. And that's where the monitoring relationship goes on. CIC or IRC monitors us. We monitor you. You monitor yourself and these occasional observers. If you hear your neighbor who has invited for this potluck ask an intrusive question of the newcomer, you might want to step in there and, you know, take them aside and say, you know, this is probably not a very appropriate question for you to ask. You know, it's totally fine, and you obviously might want to do that in a diplomatic way if it's in front of the newcomer, but that's the kind of monitoring that you will apply when you are in these situations with occasional observers, okay? Temporary housing. So obviously, with the vacancy rate, what it is, there is sometimes, there's always temporary housing arrangements needed to be put in the settlement plan. Whether one needs to draw on them or not is a different issue. But in some cases, it is necessary. We have currently a newcomer living in the house of a sponsor. Because of the circumstances, this is a very good arrangement. If that happens, then all adult members of this household need to be security screened. So they might not previously have been part of the constituent group because that was never the plan. But if you're moving somebody, if that's part of your plan, and if you put that into your settlement plan, then have these people do the screening right away, because you might have to draw on that on very short notice. Family members, so this is the newcomers, need to be together. Like there shouldn't be one somewhere in the basement and somewhere is up in under the roof, you know, so keep them sort of together in a unit. They need to have distinctly separate sleeping arrangements, so don't mix them up, you know, don't mix their children with your children and have them sleep in the same room. That's not a good idea. And children also shouldn't be left alone. Now that is, as I said, if you have monitoring, if if two of you are there and doing babysitting, you know, that's something that we wouldn't necessarily always enforce the way it's written down here. Sasha has already talked about photography and the publication of stories. That extends beyond your fundraising to when the newcomers are here, okay? So it doesn't all of a sudden change the game that now they're here, and now we're posting their photo all over the place. So good practice, you know, the other day, somebody was up skiing with a newcomer, and they sent me an email and said, Sabine, you know, we've taken all these photos, and isn't this fantastic? What about, can we post those on Facebook? And I said, don't ask me, ask the newcomer, right? Because I'm not their agent. I don't know what's dangerous for them or not. I don't know who might be looking for them or who might be looking at sites and looking for their name. I don't know that. So it is best to ask the newcomer, always keeping in mind that they might say yes because of a sense of that they can't say no. So always give them the way out. Don't just say, can I put this up on my website? Or could I put that on my Facebook? Say, what do you think about this? Might that be a problem? Do you want me to do this, or do you not want me to do this, right? So always give them a way out there. Yeah.
I think you always have to err on the side of being very, very careful. I do a lot of the Gulf Stream Nature Housing work with children's groups. And I take a lot of photographs on trips. And it is, we take from the back. I may take someone's hands, handling something, no faces, always. You just don't want to get into that situation.
Yeah. And it's a good conversation to have early on with the newcomers, because for some people it might be totally fine, and for other people it's a big no-no. So it's a good, but you're right, like always err on the side of caution. Yeah.
How are you dealing with press at the airport?
Press at the airport, we're trying to avoid it. We've so far managed to avoid them. The press, the media are not our enemies, okay? They're our friends. And they have been doing a fantastic job in keeping this discussion alive. And many of the people in the media, if we have a good conversation with them up front, they understand it, you know? Like Jean has been speaking a lot to the media. I spoke on Gregor Craigie's morning show, and I made a point of going to the studio, for example. I did that on purpose because I knew I would have a chance to have a side conversation with him. And so we can give these messages. Wherever you can, give these messages. The message is, you are our friend. We are extremely grateful for what you're doing to keep this conversation alive. At the same time, the newcomers are vulnerable persons. There might be, you know, difficulties associated with posting their information, their images, having to do with what's going on, you know, in Syria or surrounding countries. So we have to be very careful. So yeah, and I think the media are starting to catch on to that. And I think this kind of, you know, in the early days, there was really this urge to have somebody and interview somebody and do a story on them. I think it's, they understanding, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just so you know, one of the things that we've managed to arrange with the airport is that when people come in, we can meet them inside the secured area. What we can't control is the media has access to the same public information that any of us have. We can go on the CAC website and see that X number of people are destined for Victoria. It doesn't take much of a guess to figure out what plane they're going to be on because we don't have any direct flights from Toronto. So the media, you know, they might see something that says 8 people are going to arrive on this date, and they just may of their own free will show up there. But what we're trying to do to mitigate that is to meet the family first behind the security doors. So but we can't control it entirely. You know, and, you know, nor should we be able to control it entirely, but we do our best. And I think that the fundamental piece about people's images and being interviewed and other things is the minute they're here in Canada, the decision about their privacy, what they share, is their decision. It doesn't belong to ICA, it doesn't belong to a constituency group, it belongs to them. So, and that's different in different countries, but that's the situation here. So it's really good if with the interpreters, we're able to explain that to people very early on, that it's their choice, it's their information, it belongs to them. The only place where that is not true is with the media, who are clearly identified as media. So, you know, CTV comes with its CTV brand. There are restrictions on that because it's the media and it's obvious the media. The only trick is with newcomers, it may be obvious to you that that's the media, it may not be obvious to them, so you need to help them understand it.
And I'm sure there are individuals at the airport who see what's going on and take pictures.
Yeah, and you can't control what you can't control. It's, you know, you're doing your best to do that though.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think actually in the limited experience, I had that the dinner, fundraising dinner at the mosque a week or 2 ago, and there was media there from Czech, and they sort of pushed me over, and I said I wasn't willing to talk, I didn't know enough about the family, and he said, would you be willing to answer questions just from your perspective? And, you know, this is a way, actually, also is a way to get more people involved. So I think, you know, when I said I'm not going to identify them, I'm not going to tell you anything,
and I don't know their experience, they could be vulnerable. He was actually really respectful. I don't know if the thing ever showed or not, but he interviewed these people and totally got it. So I was actually surprised, to tell you the truth, that they weren't walking around with a camera, and he really got behind that potential vulnerability.
Just to repeat it for the recording. So Karen is making a good point about good practice and enforcing the point that really we can use the media to our advantage, you know, and if media want to talk, and if they ask questions that are uncomfortable with, then tell them why you can't answer that question, but tell them what you are willing to talk about. And you know, use it to everybody's advantage. Use it to raise awareness about private sponsorship of refugees. It's a very good point. Yeah, Rita.
2 points. One was around, just echoing what you said around asking permission for images. We did that, and we also discovered that the pictures that we take, that Dad normally put on his Facebook page, but they asked that we not have a picture of the mom alone without her kids. So we've done that. More to your other point around who gets to be with them and the liability and the CRCs, what we discovered was that within 48 hours, people were dropping by who were not part of our group, and they're just members of the community. And people from the mosque, people from the Syrian community, and the grapevine is very fast. And our first reaction was, we don't know them. And we'd open the door and there'd be somebody in the house. And this has happened, and they're getting rides with lots of other people. They're going around, they're going to stores, and it's a lovely, wonderful thing that's happening in the community. It's hard for us not to, initially anyway, it was hard for us not to react to that. But it is something that is helping them feel settled, and our response has been to get to know them. And to the greatest extent possible, to try and be there when we think they're going to be there, and to get to know them a little bit. But those relationships are very critical, and they're fast, and they happen all the time.
And that's a really good point. I mean, there's no way we can or should avoid this, right? Because people are looking for connections within their own community. People are going shopping, and you know, they go shopping in Mediterranean stores. We are showing them where they can go shopping, and then they meet people there, you know, that become friendly. The first thing is they exchange their phone numbers. The big piece to keep in mind is, you know, they are adults. They do make their own choices. They pick their own friends, right? If they pick somebody to be their friend, if they associate with somebody, they're free to do that, right? There's no question. We try to educate them about rules and laws and what have you in Canada. So if somebody is ferrying them around in a car and you notice that they don't have the appropriate car seats, then tell the newcomer family what the rules are around car seats, right? And then they can have that conversation with these folks that are picking them up. But yeah, that is obviously bound to happen. Generally speaking, if they make their own contacts, you know, that is basically up to them. If it is a contact that we have initiated and something untoward was to happen, like either, you know, ourselves or you as the constituent group, then we could be held liable. That's essentially where the distinction is. So I'm very acutely aware of time, and I'm thinking that everybody's probably super, super hungry. So I'll just say one word about working with the interpreters. Various interpreters, so certainly our volunteer interpreters that have so kindly signed on. So there are key elements of that relationship with interpreters. There's a whole booklet available, a guide to working with interpreters, that the Cultural Interpretation Services for Communities in Ontario has made available, and we'll put that into the resources that we will make available to you. And it's also a really good one for the volunteer interpreters to take a look at. So really the main pieces being confidentiality, whatever gets said, especially if people are in sensitive situations like in medical appointments, stays where it was said. It doesn't go anywhere, it shouldn't be shared with anybody, it has to remain confidential. Interpretation has to be accurate, so interpreters shouldn't be putting their own, you know, biases into how they interpret, or, you know, be selective around what gets interpreted and what doesn't. Of course, you as non-Arabic speakers or whatever the language might be, have no ability to judge that. So all you can do is, before you start working with an interpreter, to maybe remind them, you know, of what their role is and why they're there. They should be impartial, so they shouldn't have their own opinion. I mean, they will have their own opinions, but they shouldn't have these opinions influence the interpretation process. We all have opinions, but it's a question of whether we act on them or not. And if there is any kind of conflict of interest, it should be discussed. You know, if let's say somewhere in the process, it's very difficult to understand the nature of how different people from maybe the same country context or, you know, from the same regional context interact with one another, where there might be issues around what happened back in the home country. So we don't know these things. So we can only encourage the interpreters, if there is any kind of conflict, that they disclose this and then step away from the process if there is a conflict of interest. But it is a leap of faith because you can't understand what is being said.
I imagine, I mean, already I know you need 2 days notice, and I imagine as this, more and more people are coming in, I have 2 questions. Are you getting more interpreters signing up, either males and females? And for things like medical appointments, none of the medical language is specific, but that sense of people's comfort talking about, in translating medical issues, talking about body parts or disease, things like that. Like how are you screening your interpreters for comfort and ability to do that?
Yeah. It's a good point. So as we have said, you know, repeatedly, we've been doing this for 4 months now. We have male and female interpreters. We are planning to do more intensive, you know, training session with the interpreters. So having invited them to come here today, if they are available, was a first step, so they better understand how we are working with groups. We know that some of the groups have said they keep using the same interpreter for especially the medical appointments, where it's more sensitive, and that's a good practice. And, you know, doing a debrief with them afterwards. You can do a debrief with me if you're uncomfortable about something, or you can ask, you know, the family how they felt about it. Once they have the ability to have some basic English skills, they will be able to tell you, you know, or they might, you know, show satisfaction or lack thereof. So we can certainly, it's an evolving topic, and we can certainly have more conversations, but there are definitely male and female people. Now, the volunteer interpreters are, you know, they have their own lives. Some of them work during the day. They're not always available. That's why we need some advance notice. Yeah.
I potentially have a male and a female interpreter interested in doing it. Who should I get in touch with?
With me, yeah. They can write an email.
I guess linked to Karen's question, but as a group that's just poised to start making a whole series of medical visits, is it fair to say right now that we can go ahead and book those appointments as long as we have 2 days notice that can be accommodated?
I will try. You know, I can't speak for the availability of the interpreters. We can always, you know, we have an Arabic speaker right now on staff, so in our settlement department, so we can always send him if we have enough notice to the appointment. He is male, so he would be more suitable, certainly, to a medical appointment with the men in the family. Yeah. Yeah, and the more notice, the better, obviously. Yeah. So if it's not an emergency, it's easy enough to do 4 days. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but
in terms of getting families on the family physicians waiting list or on their roll, do we just approach our own family physicians and ask if they would be willing to take on a new person or family?
you definitely could. We have so far not experienced any difficulties for the newcomers that have arrived to find family physicians. Most of the groups have either physicians in the group or they have, friends that have said they will take them on. So that's not a concern I've heard so far. We have a group that's made up almost entirely of family physicians. Where are you guys? Yeah, so, so certainly, have a conversation. If you're concerned about that, have a conversation there. So far we have seen a great openness by family physicians to take on the newcomer cases. Okay. Yeah. So most of the groups somehow have, early on in the process, told me that they either have somebody in the group who's a physician and who will take on the family, or they know somebody. Yeah. So last question, then we really need to break for lunch.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think there are willing physicians, but as one myself who's navigated for lots, it does become a bit complicated. For example, where does the family live? And we had someone accept a family with 6 kids, but the physician's in Rodney, and we're having second thoughts. Is that really realistic? And there are other issues that are a little bit complicated. I have spoken with some physicians who have to come, so it's not an absolute given that it's breezy, but I think there are other issues that are.
Yeah. No, and I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that so far it hasn't been a huge concern, and I would certainly say you might want to have a,
I think the divisions of family practice are working on this, and so as that becomes more crystallized and through the divisions we can communicate with you as to just how that's.
So that's a good suggestion. So Division of Family Practice is apparently, they have this on their radar, and so we are all moving forward as things unfold, and we all are impatient, and we all would like to have things in place yesterday, and they're not, but they will come into place.